Up. Well, hey everyone, we're going to get started here. I'm going to roll through a few announcements. I think you know who I am. I'm Jen Miller, broadcasting out of my house right now. I'm the director of the League of Women Voters, and I will be the moderator / conversationalist with Aaron Ockerman. He and I kind of are old, like comrades in this. Like we should really do something. We need to do a road show. We were on Ann Fisher so many times and some other public radio together. Let's go to, we got a couple things. Okay, it's our convention. Conventions are a big deal for a league. We were actually formed out of a convention. When we say convention, it's like what we were talking about back in the anti-slavery conventions or the suffrage conventions. It was at a convention where we were formed. The Ohio Women's Suffrage Association transformed into the league in May 1920. Usually it's a long weekend that's packed. This year we are spreading it across. But let me just say this about the workshops. There are so many on so many great topics, and it is very cheap. So I think it's only $15, but please register right away so that you can enjoy some of these workshops. And let's go to the next slide. Just a reminder that we are 100 years old, and we still have, I think we're closing this at the end of convention, but you can still become part of our Centennial Club, and which is, you'll get a cool pin and it'll help mark this 100th anniversary that we've had. And also just remember that members are the lifeblood of our organization. In fact, this right here, I'm the only paid staff person, I think, that is going to be with you all day. It is volunteers and members who run this, so please make sure you join. And with that, I think it is my pleasure to introduce Aaron Ockerman. You need a new photo, buddy, because you haven't had that goatee for a long time. Sorry, I get to pick on him. All right, so Aaron is a graduate of the University of Dayton. He has had a lot of different roles in politics. He actually interned for John Boehner, Lou Blessing, Bob Latta, several more. He works for the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Comp. That's fascinating. Now I know whose brain to pick when I need to understand that. He represents a number of interests down at the Ohio State House as an independent lobbyist. He is the executive director of the Ohio Association of Elections Officials. That's just one of his many roles. I know he also does work with the public health community as well. He's married with 2 kids and he lives in the Columbus area. And I just want to say welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you to your team and Mike and everyone else that's making this possible. Happy to be here. And yeah, I'll update my picture as soon as I lose 25 pounds. That's the deal I'm with myself. So,
well, I think you look good, buddy. So, all right, let's tell us about yourself. Just a little bit more about what drives you in politics and anything you would like leaguers to know who also are lovers of democracy and elections.
Yeah. So no, appreciate that. You kind of hit on my background. I kind of grew up in the world of legislative politics by working as a staff person in the Ohio Senate. Was really, really lucky, I think, to work for some great members there. They taught me a lot of lessons. The gentleman I really spent most of my time with there was a guy named Lou Blessing. He's been in both the House and the Senate, back to the House, ended up serving as the number 2 leader in the House as Speaker Pro Tem. And it's really funny because now when you say that I worked for Senator Blessing, people think that it's Senator Bill Blessing, which is actually my old boss's son, just to kind of put in perspective. And feeling a little old these days. But yeah, little Billy used to run around our office, and now he's actually occupying the office that we once worked for. But Lou was, he was a Republican, but he was this great, bipartisan kind of guy. His best friend in the whole world was a guy named Frank Sawyer, who was a Democrat from up in Mansfield. And he taught me early on the importance of working across party lines and across the aisle, and that good policy is made by, bringing together and melding a lot of different perspectives. And so I'm really, really happy and grateful for the opportunity that I had to work for him, because I think it set me up nicely to do the job that I do now, which is be the executive director of the Ohio Association of Election Officials, which is a strictly 100% bipartisan organization. And so to try to kind of collate and make sense out of a lot of disparate voices and try to get everyone kind of rowing in the same direction is a real challenge. But I think that my background has helped me prepare to do that. And it's a lot of fun, and it's a real joy to work with that group.
Great. So the elections officials, so that's the 88 boards of elections. Can you just tell a little bit more about the organization? When was it founded? What are the kinds of things that y'all work on together?
Yeah, we're not quite as old as the league, or he's young. Well, we're not quite 100 years young, I guess, at this point, but we've been around for a while. Close to 60 years, I believe. And we are, as you mentioned, it's the 88 county boards of elections. It's the 4 individuals who comprise every board of election, the 2 Republicans, the 2 Democrats that oversee the day-to-day, that oversee kind of the management of the board. And then it's the directors and the deputy directors who are, again, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, who manage the day-to-day, as well as the clerks and the staff that work on the front lines at the boards. All of those people comprise our association. So
election operations, integrity, security, there's a heart of that has to do with this bipartisan kind of collaboration and chain of custody of ballots. Something some of our visitors might not know is that something the league actually championed a long time ago. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that strength of having Republicans and Democrats work together to make sure our elections function well?
Yeah, I think it is the absolute bedrock and hallmark of the way we do things in Ohio. So we always say, when the election officials walk into the office at 8 or 8:30 in the morning, whatever political party they were appointed from, they take that hat off and they don't put it on again until they leave that office. So if a Democratic office holder comes up to pull petitions at a board of elections and a Republican goes up to take care of them, that they will treat them exactly the same as if it was a Republican office holder, and vice versa. If one of your members comes up and they want to register to vote, or they have questions about how elections work, when they leave that counter, we don't want them to know if they were served by a Republican or a Democrat. It means that much to us. And it's really interesting. I mean, we look around at all the angst that's going on either in Columbus or at the nation's capital, and it kind of breaks our hearts because that doesn't happen at boards of elections in Ohio. We do work together to the point where it's not even really bipartisan. It's more nonpartisan. We just want to run good elections. We just want to serve our voters. We want to serve the public. We want our process to be transparent and open and accessible. And we're not concerned about how people vote. We just want them to vote. And that's just the bedrock of everything we do in our association and at the boards of elections around the state.
The elections officials and league members have a lot in common, and that's one of those things. We don't care either how someone votes or who they're going to vote for. We just really want everyone to participate. So let's get started. Let's talk about 2020. We had record participation in the fall, and boy, it was a whirlwind year that you and I tried to navigate together as much as possible, because I'll be honest with everyone who's listening, as a voter advocate, it's really important for us to understand what elections officials need, right? And their perspective. We don't always agree, but their job is to make the election run. Our job is to make sure that voters can interact with those electoral systems with ease and not be confused. Last year was a pretty confusing year, but I'm wondering if you want to tell us about the highlights, the things that went well and the things that we learned about the election system.
Sure, yeah. And let me maybe even take a step back, because I think you kind of talked about the philosophy of the league, and just to kind of maybe share with some of your members this is kind of my personal philosophy and analogy of how things work and why I do think we can and should work together very well. I always say that elections are like, being an election administrator is like being the captain of a great big cruise ship that is navigating its way through the waters of the North Atlantic, and it's this monolithic, monumental thing that doesn't turn real quick. And there's all kinds of icebergs out there, and you're just looking ahead and trying to move this boat that isn't real nimble and doesn't move real well through these waters. And you're just hoping that by the time you get to the election day, you look down and the name on the side of your boat is not the Titanic. That's what you want. And so we're kind of up there. We're kind of on the bridge trying to steer this big, massive thing. And I think folks like the league and women's and League of Women Voters and voter advocates, they're the people that are down there. And when we hit these icebergs, whether they're big or small, I mean, you are on the front lines of making sure that people are getting in life rafts and they're getting pulled out of the water. And so, your role is no more less or more important than ours and vice versa, but they are different roles, right? We have this responsibility for this monolithic thing. You have you have the responsibility for saving individual lives one at a time. And so they're different roles, but they're equally important and they're very symbiotic. And to your point earlier, we need each other. We need you doing your jobs for us to be successful, and you need us doing our jobs for us to be successful. Are we going to agree 100% of the time? No, doesn't mean we don't have the same mission and the same goal. It just means our roles are different, and sometimes our perspectives are different. And that's actually a strength of our system, not a weakness. So sorry, that was a long monologue about kind of.
Oh, I think it's great. And that's a good one. You know what? I mean, I'll keep that one in mind because I talk about election day as being like wedding, where every neighborhood in Ohio is having a massive wedding. Lots of details, lots of things that could, potentially go wrong, but ultimately, we pull it off every year, right?
And much like a wedding, things always do go wrong, but at the end of the day, if you're married, it was a success, right? And if elected people and our democracy continues to move forward, then it's been a success. And yeah, that's a great analogy as well.
Well, hopefully there's no bridezillas for the next election coming up. All right, well, let's go. Or groomzillas. I think there can be groomzillas, just for the record. All right, tell us about 2020.
2020 was a year unlike any other. And I don't really, it's hard to put it in perspective. I mean, the night before the primary, if you ask any election official, was the absolute single longest, most traumatic event of that person's life in all likelihood. It was difficult, to say the least. And then the uncertainty that loomed afterwards about when's the primary going to be, how are we going to conduct it, what's the legislature going to demand of us or expect of us, what are our voters demanding and expecting, what's the Secretary of State demanding and expecting, just a lot of angst, but we did get through it. And it wasn't ideal and it wasn't perfect, but we managed to muddle through very, very challenging circumstances. And then I want to say, I do thank the Secretary of State, because I think he really took the bull by the horns. He did some initiatives around poll worker recruitment and around communications that helped us learn from those experiences of the primary and get ready for the fall. And I think because of that, because of the work of the league and because of the work of my members and lots of other people, we had, in my estimation, and you can't argue that it was a successful election in November of 2020. It was fantastic. Turnout was through the roof, which in a pandemic, can you imagine? We set the record for sheer raw number of voters. That's unbelievable to me. We managed to muddle through PPE and social distancing and all of that stuff that was on top of an extraordinarily difficult election, extraordinarily difficult presidential elections. But I'm so proud of my folks, because that didn't happen by chance. I mean, that was 80-hour weeks that no one ever knows about, that, they spent away from their families and their friends, and they sacrificed so much to make that happen, as did your members and everyone. Really, we just pulled together as this kind of elections community and made that happen for our voters. And again, it wasn't an accident. It was a lot of planning, a lot of hard work by a lot of people. And I'm just, again, we woke up the day after the election and we just kind of said, wow, that was something we're going to tell our grandkids about.
Absolutely. Well, I want to definitely talk about some of the policy things we might have learned and kind of building in resiliency into the system, because I think our system showed that it's resilient. That doesn't mean that everyone had equal access. Some had more barriers than others, but we're going to get there. But first, as we talk about this record turnout, from your perspective, what's one thing that we should or can do to keep participation rates that high always?
Well, I would say that we had 59% of the people vote before Election Day. And most election officials will tell you that the 27 days leading up to the election were hyper stressful, and Election Day was actually pretty easy, all things considered. So I think from a policy perspective, we should continue to embrace that and welcome that and listen to our voters and how they want to vote, and making sure that we have those options and avenues available to them. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit in the context of House Bill 294 at some point. But that was, I think for us, that was a real eye-opener, being responsive, taking that big Titanic ship and being nimble enough to adapt to what our voters wanted was really important.
I think that's a really good point, because sometimes you'll hear someone say, well, we should just be voting on election day. And I like to point out that actually early voting and absentee voting really also serves those voters who are waiting to vote at their neighborhood polling location on election day. Would you want to expand on that in any way, how that might help?
Well, sure. Every voter that votes before election day is a voter that's not standing in line on election day. And if I've learned anything from my folks over the years, it's that there is, look, I don't want to say it is easy for election administrators to run 3 separate elections at once, because that's what we're doing. We're running in-person absentee voting. We're running a mail special election, a mail-based special election, and then we're running an election day election as well. That is a challenge. Logistically, that is a challenge for my folks, but it pays dividends in the fact that if you do each of those 3 well, it should be a good process for your voters. It should make things easier. And again, on election day, we found that because so many people had already participated, and because we had good rules around how we could make sure that things went smoothly on election day, that was a good process.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're starting to talk about resiliency here a little bit. The great thing about Ohio going into the pandemic is that we have Ohioans have a freedom to cast their ballot in different ways. And each one of those ways is secure. And they all have different benefits in terms of accessibility too. And so I'd like to just talk about the concept of absentee, how that worked and what you think could be better about the absentee voting process. Because the absentee voting process, while and of course the league supported it, really championed it when we got that passed, no excuse absentee, was great. But it was passed at a time when our mail service was really a primary means of communication for the entire country. It's really changed, as has our digital systems. And so could we just talk about absentee voting in general and what you think works about it here in Ohio and what we could improve?
So I think one of the biggest strengths is that we're able to process absentee ballots before election day, meaning that as the mail rolls in every day, we can go ahead and we can, check all the identification, make sure that the person that sent us the ballot matches up with the person that we mailed the ballot to. We can take them out of the envelope once we confirm the identity. We actually have, I was just in a board of elections and they have this thing that looks like a big corkscrew, and they set all the ballots in there and then they corkscrew this thing down to flatten them out. Because believe it or not, it takes a lot of time to take an individual ballot that's been folded and, move it back and forth over the edge of a table to flatten it out to get to go to the reader. So we can do all of that. And then we can actually send it through those scanners before election day. That doesn't mean we're counting the ballot, right? We have to be very clear about that. We're processing it. That ballot goes into a very secure site where it is held, where you need Republican, Democrat access to get that information. We're not releasing results ahead of time, but we can do all that work ahead of time, which means that at 7:30 p.m. on election day, we push one button and all those votes that have come in, either in person or by mail, we know those results right away as soon as the polls close. That was huge. Not every state does that. That served us very well. I think the biggest improvement we can make is to have an online ballot absentee request system. That would have benefited us so much because, Jen, to your point, we need to get the post office out of this process as much as possible. It's not what it was, and the thing I hear from my election officials all the time is we love the post office. They're great partners. They work their butts off. They are underfunded and underappreciated. And so this is no casting of stones at them whatsoever. But we just need, if there are ways to automate the process, if there are ways to modernize the process, if there are ways to engage our voters in other means, we should be exploring those. And online absentee ballot request, in my opinion, is a no-brainer.
I agree. And that's in 294. But something else that's in this mega elections bill is actually a limit to Dropboxes. And would you talk about that? Because for me, that's a massive weakness in 294. And so what's your perspective or your association's perspective on the value of Dropboxes?
So here's our position, our official position, and we've had lots of conversations about Dropboxes, and they've become a real lightning rod. I don't have to tell anyone on this call, so I'll just be very unequivocal in stating how my association feels about them. We think every county should have at least one, and it should be at the Board of Elections. And then to the extent that Board of Elections on a bipartisan basis wants to expand that number out to libraries or the wherever you want to put them, as long as the local board of elections can agree that there's a need, can agree there's a mechanism to fund them because they are expensive, then that should be allowed to happen with those decisions taking place at the local level. I think it's one thing it's important to remember is that, Dropboxes were not used widely before the pandemic. There were certainly counties that did use them and they enjoyed having them and they saw the benefits. I think that this was, I would call it like an innovation that resulted from the pandemic, and we shouldn't shy away from learning lessons and being able to build upon our successes. And Dropboxes were a success. And so to the extent that we want to continue to offer those to voters, that's our position, is that we should, whether it's one or several or many, those should be local decisions.
And this limits it to 10 days. So there are up to 3, but all at the same location, which I think from our perspective, as we think about accessibility across the county, especially for those who may not have vehicles or rely on transportation, we don't have great public transit here in Ohio. Thinking about rural Ohioans, which is myself, where I'd have to have driven multiple towns over to drop my ballot. So we have 2 questions for you. What's your thought on really limiting to just 10 days for a Dropbox, especially when it's out of Board of Elections? I'm not sure what that might solve. And then I think you already did the second, which is about multiple locations per county. But if you want to opine on that, welcome to.
Sure. So one thing that my boards have told me is that the Dropboxes have value beyond just receiving ballots. They actually get communications from other other county agencies where they'll just drop it off, whatever it might be, their water bill or whatever goes into the Dropbox. And voters will use that to drop off registrations or stuff. So, we call them ballot Dropboxes, but in reality, they serve a lot of other purposes. So we've been, I think we've been very clear with the sponsors of the bill as to what our preference would be. In fairness, they've got to get 50 votes. And I don't know what the political realities of getting 50 votes looks like at this point. I will tell you, we're going to continue to work with the legislature and members of both political parties to tell them why we see value in having our proposal move forward. And we think it's a pretty common sense way to approach it. I mean, there are proposals out there that would call for upwards of 1,200 Dropboxes around the state. We don't personally think that's the greatest of ideas either. We think ours is a pretty middle of the road consensus way that maybe we could go about tackling this issue.
How about the number of early vote centers? This is another one that, in our opinion, and we think early vote, we understand that it's labor intensive, but it has been such a game changer since 2004 when we had such long lines. Again, thinking about seniors, people with disabilities, just everyday hardworking family folks who could really use multiple early vote centers across the counties. Do you want to talk about that? This bill doesn't change the number of early vote centers. So let's talk about that first.
Sure. Yeah, it's long been our position that, very similar to Dropboxes. In fact, we kind of modeled our Dropbox proposal on our longstanding policy or belief on multiple early voting locations, that it should be a local decision and there should be local political will to make that happen. But we do clearly see the value in having more than one location, particularly as it relates to the larger urban counties and some of the smaller population, but larger geographic rural counties. I had Washington County, which has about 40,000 registered voters, I think, say, we might consider doing 4 of these things. If we can get our commissioners to fund it, I think our board would go for that because we're a big, tough county to get around, lots of hills and rivers and all kinds of fun stuff down there. And if we could put one in each corner of our county, that would make it a lot easier for us.
That's great. So, and just a reminder in terms of Dropboxes, before we leave that, they're monitored 24/7. And they're emptied by a Republican and Democrat from the Board of Elections. So it's really secure, and we also respect the Postal Service, but just clearly it's the most efficient way to return an absentee ballot would be to get it in that ballot box or that drop location, because that way it's not exposed to the elements. It's not necessarily leaving the county or state to be sorted to come back. So, but let's go to the day before Election Day. The final, right now we have 28 days of early voting. that Monday before election day is something that the elections officials have wanted to, while you support early voting, you've wanted to have that day removed. Can you tell us why?
Sure.
Like to have that not be a voting day?
Sure. Yeah. And to be clear, we have never advocated that we eliminate any hours of early voting. What we've asked for is that the hours that are currently Monday, which I believe is 9 to 2 or 8 to 2, that those 6 hours be reallocated at times which candidly are more convenient for voters, weekends, evenings, things like that. And the reason, and so I don't want it to be mischaracterized, and it irks me a little bit when I hear people saying we want to cut early voting. That's not what we're asking to do. We have, I think, 162 hours or somewhere right around there. Right now, we're advocating that we keep all those hours, but just put them in a time that works better, again, for the Titanic that is the election system. And really, there are a couple things that I would share with your members as to why we are for that. The Monday before is just chaotic, would not even be close to appropriate description of the day before the election. There are, literally hundreds of tasks that election officials are having to complete the last 24 hours before we actually open up the polling locations all over the county. And so it's just logistically very, very challenging. One of the big ones that is driving this decision about my membership is the fact that we cannot update the poll books that go out for people on election day. And I'm going to, if you indulge me, just to get in the weeds a little bit, it takes a while to explain. We can't get those out to the polling locations until we close down the actual early in-person voting process, meaning that if I, Aaron Ockerman, show up at my Board of Elections at 1:59 p.m. on Monday and I want to vote, I'm absolutely entitled to do that right now. What that means is that because I'm registered in Westerville 1A, my election officials then have to account for the fact that I voted at 1:59. And when I show up, if I were to show up at 6:30 the next day and want to vote, the poll worker would have to see in the poll book, hey, this person just has already voted. They need to cast a provisional ballot. It is if you think about a county like Franklin County, where you have hundreds of polling locations and thousands of poll books that need updated between the hours of 2 p.m. or whenever after, the lines tamp down, and to get those updated and out to the polling location by 6:30 the next day, that's a monumental task. And I would just tell you, we are, with electronic poll books, we are one technical glitch away from complete and catastrophic failure, which is exactly what happened in Franklin County in 2020. Now, that was a failure of technology. It was a success when it came to the fact that we had paper poll books out there. So we were able to adjust on the fly, and no one was disenfranchised as a result of that, which is good. But what it meant is, on election day, when I went to vote at my precinct, it takes literally 3 or 4 times longer to process someone in a paper poll book than it does an electronic poll book, which means the lines were going to be longer. So I can't tell you how many people showed up at their polling place on that Tuesday, saw a huge line and said, forget it, I'm going home. That we might have been able to stave off if we had actually had an efficient system that allowed us to use our electronic poll books on that Tuesday. So not to make excuses, and I hate to admit when my members don't do things 100% correct, but that was an issue that could have been completely avoided if we had cut off voting on Sunday and reallocated those Monday hours back over that Sunday or Saturday. So again, I appreciate you letting me maybe talk a little bit too long on that, but it's a complicated issue, which drives us to our policy decisions.
But I think what we're talking about, again, is the resiliency of the system. One of the things that both of our organizations are focused on regularly is if something does go down, again, because we're either driving a ship that doesn't turn very well or we're having weddings across the state, that we need to be able to kind of pivot. And so I think maybe something that a lot of voters or even candidates or campaigns understand is how much time we spend thinking about all of these details. Can you explain quickly what an election administration plan is and why it matters? Because obviously they matter a lot to League, but I'd love to have you talk about them.
This is why we work so well. Either you read my mind or I read yours. I don't know how, but I was just going to segue into EAPs. Yeah, we do election administration plans. they are our business plan. They account for everything that we do at the board. They contain myriad contingencies. What happens if you can't use your electronic poll books? What happens if a poll worker doesn't show up? What happens if a squirrel chews through the power line at the Board of Elections on election day? All those contingencies are accounted for, bomb threats at polling locations. And those are documents that we've created and updated consistently for about the past 10 years. One of the things that we worked with the league on is to codify those and put that requirement in our state law, so that if a new Secretary of State comes in and doesn't see value in doing EAPs, they will not have the ability, like they do currently, to no longer require them. So I think that's a great thing that's happening in 294, one that the league has long sought and one that we're happy to partner with you on and trying to get that across the finish line.
I want you to know that within the feed and also in my phone, I'm getting texts, like your members have fans. I'm hearing how great Lake County is or Lorain County. And so I think, if I haven't done it yet, I should just say we at League do appreciate all the elections officials and poll workers, how hard they work. And a large portion of my members are poll workers. So just want to express our appreciation for that. I keep getting the question of why change election laws now? And I think it is frustrating in some ways for you and I, Aaron, because you and I and the Secretary of State and a whole bunch of others last year, after we saw what happened with the primary, tried to get some things improved, right? We tried to get online absentee requests. We tried to get multiple early vote centers, and and multiple drop boxes per county. These are things we tried to do. And now all of a sudden we're seeing this push that's come out of the House with 294 and potentially something incredibly draconian out of the Senate. Why do you think we're doing this now?
So I was asked this question by the press, and I'll just answer it the same way. There is not. So I've been with OAO for 20 years, and there hasn't been a single presidential election where I have not seen some kind of response by the legislature afterwards. And to me, that's just natural, because it's the most high profile election. Legislators are reading about in the paper. They're seeing the good, the bad, the ugly. And they're saying, well, as a state legislator, how should I be responding to this? So to me, it's natural that we're seeing a lot of interest by both political parties, from both chambers of the House and Senate. I'm not surprised by that in the slightest. And candidly, we typically wouldn't be asking for big policy changes in a presidential year, because we are planning a wedding, right? And no one wants to change the caterer 3 days before the wedding. That was particularly in response to the pandemic and the fact that we needed to evolve and turn our boat quickly to respond to the pandemic, which none of, how do you see coming? But candidly, this is not a bad time to be talking about changes to election law. We can, if we can arrive at some consensus and get a good bipartisan bill, or a good bill with great changes that we all, agree to, now would be the time to do it, because then we would have a little bit of lead time before the next big election to actually implement those changes. Typically, we don't want to be doing this in an even year either way, because that's tumultuous and traumatic for this system.
How much do you think concerns of fraud are driving legislative conversations? And also, please set the record straight on fraud too. We often do that in our own communities, and we'd love to hear how you set the record straight.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo what's out there publicly. The Secretary of State has done studies that document both fraud and suppression, and both occur in very small quantities, at least according to the official results that have been generated. So I think we, as kind of people who oversee the system, we do see instances of both. They're extraordinarily rare, and candidly, those extremes should not be driving the policies that we're trying to get, which are generally, more toward both the political middle and I think just the policy middle of trying to create a good, sound system that works for everybody. So no, I my members don't call me all the time and say we've got massive fraud, or people are not able to vote for that matter either. We don't see that. So I think maintaining and building upon the successes that we've experienced over the past 20 years is part and parcel of what we're trying to get done at the legislature this time around. And I do think, unfortunately, the national narrative has fed into what we're seeing in Ohio. I spent the better part of the day after the election in November to this very day educating legislators about how we do things in Ohio, why responding to whatever they did in Georgia, Kentucky, Illinois, Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, wherever, is probably not appropriate actions for Ohio to take, because we've done things historically very well. We have a good system that we can build on. It's not prone to fraud or suppression, and we shouldn't tilt it in either direction.
So I definitely want to have you back. I want to make sure, and I want to transition to talk about a couple other things, but just for those who are listening, League stance on House Bill 294 is one of concern. There's definitely provisions in there that we really appreciate, like online absentee requests, though we're concerned about all the extra IDs, and codifying election administration plans, which you talked about, which were first secured through a lawsuit that League brought after 2004, claiming, and the court agreed, that we just had not done adequate planning for that level of turnout. But here's one thing I just want to mention is I think we are thinking a lot of people will continue to vote absentee or early. We think that we're still not out of this pandemic, unfortunately, and that we will likely see more pandemics in our lifetime. And we had lines at the Dropboxes that in some counties backed up onto the highway, right? And we also had lines, and this isn't to beat up on boards of elections at all, but we also had lines at early vote centers, sometimes 3.5, 4 hours long during a weekday. And so anything that cuts access to Dropboxes and is the wrong direction. We think we should be increasing Dropbox access. We should be increasing early vote locations across the counties. And so that's a big deal for us. Before we stop on HB 294, there's also some really confusing stuff around IDs. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that, because when I read it, I think that it could take longer when someone's checking in. I think it could confuse poll workers or voters, because it's hard to train every poll worker on every little detail. And so would you like to talk about what's going on with these suggested ID changes in HB 294?
Sure. Yeah, obviously the bill came out Thursday, I think, and so we are still in the throes of reviewing it as well. That's not a provision we were, familiar with before it came out, so I don't know that I can officially comment about whether we like it or hate it or don't care about it. That'll, my legislative committee, my trustees are going to tell me that in the very near future. So on that one in particular, we need to understand it a little better before we probably comment on it.
Okay, that's fine. Well, we'll look forward to that. One thing I'll just mention is we do understand how hard the work of poll workers is, and we understand how hard it is to train a poll worker to juggle and manage all the things. So we want to work with you on that. We think the ID piece, and again, it's confusing to me. Some of these things, like what's the problem with having the Dropbox open the entire 28 days, 28 days before the election and only doing 10? I don't see what problem we're trying to solve there. Similarly, we don't have fraud in Ohio. Fortunately, it's exceedingly rare. As you suggested, Republican and Democrat secretaries of state continue to attest. Our hardworking elections officials continue to attest. So why are we doing these ID changes? But let's switch a little bit to, and first, let me thank you for all of that, for the continued dialogue, for those of you who are tuning in. This is the kind of conversation that Aaron and I have all the time. There's a lot of times we don't agree, but there's a lot we do agree on. And we're always just trying to understand the perspectives of our two constituencies, because we think that could make better elections policy. And man, if you and I could make the elections policy, we really would be world-class and second to none as a state, I'm convinced. But let's switch, because we're getting ready to end here. I want to just talk about redistricting for a little bit. And I know you're not advocating necessarily on redistricting, Aaron, but you do, your stakeholders, all the boards of elections have a role that they play. And so I was wondering if, we like to just kind of pull back the curtain, right? And so what's the role of elections officials when we make new districts? And what are the kinds of things we consider in terms of your needs?
Sure. So once the legislature or the apportionment board or whatever the new body is that's going to be setting these districts makes those determinations, it's up to the boards of elections to then take those new boundaries and carve them up into precincts and assign people to precincts and voting locations. And that's a very labor intensive, task that we work with like our county GIS department on to understand, where the rivers are and how we can move people around so that they may be in a precinct where they're not having to cross a river to vote or whatever the case may be, if there's a precinct or a polling location that's more conducive to them. So it's a very kind of nuanced technical role that we play. So to your point, we haven't really weighed in on the overall larger policy areas that kind of drive redistricting and re-precincting reform, other than, Jen, you and I have talked in the past about the possibility of one of our roles being, once we've arrived at those new districts and people need to understand where they're situated, where they're going to be voting, who they're going to be voting for. Those kinds of things are right in our wheelhouse to try to educate our voters about.
Great. I got one more question for you, and I bet you're going to want to punt, but we think that we should build a little more time into the system for redistricting. And we really would like to see a primary that's in June, could be, first or second week of June. I continue to hear when we change dates, that's a problem. My sense is that we might end up having to change dates anyway. So wouldn't it be better for boards of elections if we gave them the heads up now? I just want to have you respond to this idea of maybe changing the primary date, because the census data is going to be several months behind, and yes, we can start that process now and should be with hearings and things. But your thought on moving the primary?
Yeah, tell me what the options are, and the other options are, and I'll tell you if I like it. How about that?
So one option is to stick with the May, and everyone has to squish really hard, potentially even the boards of elections having to really have tight timelines between, candidate filing deadline, just having candidates figure out where they're living and figuring all of that. And so just a tight timeline, potentially. Another option is to not be able to do it by May 10th and actually have to move it back, but you wouldn't know until December or January. And I think the third option is just to proactively change it now or very soon.
Sure. Well, yeah. And I mean, to your point, the earlier we know, the better, because elections, just like weddings, are all about planning. And so the more time you have to arrange for your floral arrangements and your food choices, the better. And so, yeah, we need to know, we would like to know as soon as possible what the legislature would expect and demand of us as it relates to the primary next year. I can tell you that, bifurcating the primary into one for congressional candidates and one for state legislative candidates and statewide office holders is not something we're thrilled about. The closer you move us back to November, the more problematic it becomes for us in order to prepare for, what is going to be a busier November election than a primary election. So those are the kinds of factors that would go into our decision making, I guess. But I would wholeheartedly agree with your point that the sooner everyone knows, the better off we all are.
And what's your budget need? Because you do obviously have, once every 10 years, you got to do the back end of getting voters in the right spot. And I think this year the districts could look very different, which means we could have some very confused voters. So we might need more money for voter education. What's the budget allocation that you think you need at this point?
So we haven't had specific conversations. So I can just tell you historically, we got about $2.75 million last time. That was done through the same, interestingly enough, Jen, and this is kind of wonkish, that was not done through the budget. It was actually done through the redistricting bill itself.
Oh, okay.
And so, I would say that would be the baseline that we should start from. That was 10 years ago. So inflation alone tells me that number is somewhat higher. If you start to factor in some voter education efforts around the re-precincting process, then, I think, again, that number could be higher, but certainly we haven't had detailed conversations about that at this point, still trying to figure out what the expectations are.
Here's my last question. This is your final word, but if there's one thing, if you had a magic wand and you could get League to do one thing with our brand and our passionate members, what would that be?
Continue to communicate at the local level with my membership. I think you and I having, the relationship we do is great, but nothing is going to replace local leagues working with local boards of elections, understanding each other's roles on the Titanic and helping, save lives and keep the boat afloat. Those conversations mean the world to us. And so I would just encourage you to continue to to continue with that dialogue. We appreciate everything you do around poll worker recruitment. We appreciate your advocating with commissioners to better fund boards of elections. All those things are evidence that, you know, we are working together for the betterment of our overall system and for individual voters, which is what's, you know, core to both of our missions. So that would be my request.
And we had a big, I mean, one victory that I think we had together last year was that we worked together to get 66 counties, 66 boards of elections, Center for Tech and Civic Life funds that were used in nonpartisan ways just to increase the capacity of boards of elections. And that was millions of dollars, right? You and I tried along with many others to get more state funding because of the pandemic or federal funding that fell through, but we were able to find some nonpartisan funds for boards of elections.
Yeah, and don't forget the poll worker recruitment either. You know, this was the only election I've ever been associated with in 20 years where I had boards calling me saying, what are we supposed to do with all these extra poll workers? I don't know what to do with these people. I mean, that has never happened before. So again, a lot of kudos to you and Secretary LaRose for coming up with innovative ways to turn people out in a pandemic to work at polling locations. So thank you for your efforts there as well.
So we're still getting lots of compliments about just this conversation and just lots of fans of their boards of elections in the audience. I want to just thank you so much, Aaron. This is just the beginning of a conversation. We're going to have you back. And we'll definitely see you in the State House. And if we can see those slides, Miss Cynthia, Aaron, it was great having you. That's Aaron's website if you want to learn more about the elections officials. And yes, elections officials and poll workers are the backbone of our democracy. So make sure you continue to be a poll worker. Remember that today's the last day to register for our convention. We will have experts talking about the diverse needs of voters. We have tactical things like social media 101, many different kinds of events that you can learn from. We do have a program for young leaders, Youth in Action. If you have a young person excited about democracy, please get them engaged with us. Please consider donating to the Centennial Club. That is closing here in just a little bit of time, and please become a member. And with that, we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you, Aaron. It's been really fun. And thank you, Cynthia and Alice and Michael, who always make me look so good. And Iris, our board president.